Great. Okay, thanks, Heather. All right. So welcome everyone to our discussion forum, and these are based on our Delta Think News and Views series, as you know. For the regulars, welcome back, and we're happy to see you again. And for any new folks joining us for the first time today, we're thrilled to have you. So thanks for joining, and hopefully you'll make a habit of this in the future. I'll start off with introductions. I'm Lori Carlin, Chief Commercial Officer at Delta Think, and with me today are my colleagues and the News and Views authors, Dan Pollock, our Chief Digital Officer at Delta Think, and along with Ann Michael, an architect of the Delta Think Data and Analytics tool, and Heather Staines, Senior Consultant here at Delta Think and the Director of Community Engagement for the Data and Analytics tool. If you've joined us for a News and Views session or forum before, then you know we've designed these to be interactive with lots of questions and participations from you all. So I hope you're ready for a lively and informal discussion. A few logistical items before we begin. If you have a question, you can ask it in the Q&A box. That would be really helpful if you put your questions there. As far as structure, we'll have some opening remarks to kick us off, and then we'll move into questions and open discussion after that. We have a few questions to discuss, and then we'll look to you folks in the Q&A for your questions. And the session is set to run an hour, but really, if we don't have a lot of questions, we may go shorter than that. That doesn't usually happen with market sizing, but we'll see. And so thank you again for joining us, and I'll hand off to Heather now to get us started.
Great. Thanks for that, Lori. And in keeping with our usual trends, we do not have slides to show you. The things we're going to be, talking about today were published last week in our latest News and Views, and we'll be referring to some of our other News and Views as well. So if you want to, dig deeper on those types of things, you can just check, those publications. So before I hand over to Dan for the headlines, I just wanted to talk a little bit about our methods. As usual, we are very, very grateful to the organizations that participate in our annual publisher survey. We take the responses from that survey, anonymize and aggregate the information that comes back to us to inform our estimates. And for those folks who are joining us today, you'll be getting, a detailed market update to peruse. Our market estimates focus on research publications for which money is likely to be paid, either to read or to publish. We focus on the underlying trends to inform strategic decision-making. Open access in this context thus excludes bronze or free to read but not free to reuse, as well as green OA. Each year, we find our data is improving, so we will restate figures as needed to keep them up to date. So I will hand over to Dan to kick off with this year's headlines.
Thanks, Heather. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So, Jeske, the big headline we found looking at the full year ended 2023 is that we think that open access as a share of articles published, has hit a bit of a peak. It's struggling to get past the 50% mark. So in years previous to this update, we found that open access as a share of output has been growing. I think last year it was high 40%. We thought it was on target to break through the 50% barrier in 2023. Turns out that didn't happen. There were some big things that happened in 2023, and we'll get on to the why behind the numbers, I'm sure, in the discussions. So it looks like open access share of output has peaked a hair over 50%, and we think it is likely to fall back by a few percentage points in the coming few years. That is a prediction. Predictions are notoriously difficult, especially about the future. So who knows what else may happen. We've had all sorts of outlying events over the last few years, COVID, recessions, etc., etc., etc. So of course we have to attach a healthy caveat to any of our forward-looking numbers. So that share of publication output terms of the money that we think that's raising, we think that the open access market grew to just over 2.2 billion US dollars in 2023. And just to put that in context, the overall scholarly journals market we think was a shade under $11 billion in 2023. So what all this means is that open access, we think, is accounting for around about 50% of the output, but around about 20% of the corresponding value. And those ratios seem to have stayed fairly consistent for the last 2 years and only shifted a tiny bit over the last 2 or 3 years. Just a couple of other headlines, and then we can get into things. In terms of the value of the, in fact, let me make sure I've got my numbers lined up here. In terms of growth in output, we think that the value of the open access market grew by 1.7% in 2023 compared with 2022, and the value in the overall scholarly journals market grew by 1.2% in the same period. And then just to put some of those numbers in context, the open access market in 2022 grew by over 10 times the amount it did the year before, whereas the overall journals market grew by about 5%. So about 2 or 3 times that number as it did the year before. So stating the numbers another way, the open access market grew by 24% in 2022, shrinking to 1.7% in 2023. Overall scholarly journals market 5%, shrinking to 1.2%. So really, the what has been a historical, very, very strong growth in open access appeared to have collapsed in 2023 to fractions of its historical levels. And we think that trend is set to continue because there's some structural changes that we think are going on. So just to put those numbers in context, as a 3-year average, the compound annualized growth rate, CAGR, which is just the average growth per year, we think between 2023 and 2026, the average growth each year, the CAGR, will be 4.9% in open access output and 6.3% in open access value. And that compares with around about 13% for both of those numbers when we were looking at the equivalent time period this time last year. So that's me done with the headlines. I'm sure we'll get into more bits and pieces as we go on. I'd like to hand it back to Heather or Laurie in case you have any questions. Want me to go over any of those numbers again?
Yeah. Well, the first question that we have is our regular readers of News and Views may recall that in July we had a sneak peek of these numbers, and they were a bit different. Do you want to talk about that? Why? What changed between July and now? How that came to be?
Yes, absolutely. So when we look at open access's share of scholarly output, I said it peaked at around about 50%. So based on our latest data, we think open access accounted for 50.1% of output in 2023 and 50% of output in 2022. Our sneak peek had those same numbers as 50% in 2023 and 48% in 2022. So just the shade difference. That's all to do with between then and now, we've had some final submissions for our survey that enable us to refine our numbers. And when we plug those in and recalculate the underlying trends, so imagine we start with a kind of a wiggly line of growth and we smooth it out to find out the averages each year. If a couple of data points shift slightly, then that smooth line can just tilt very slightly when we recalculate the numbers. So that's why we've seen that couple of percentage point different in the 2022 numbers now compared with our sneak peek. I don't think it changes the headline. The sneak peek said we seem to be hitting a peak and things were definitely slowing down. and looking like they could possibly go into reverse. So I think the underlying trends stay the same. It's just the nuance of the data has changed slightly. And yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I think any eagle-eyed reader or listener may raise that as a question, and we hope that anticipates any difference in numbers.
Yeah, so that's really the story, is that the underlying trends have changed, as opposed to any particular peak or number that we're looking at in isolation, right?
Yeah, so underlying trends have stayed the same between our sneak peek and here. Yeah, it's just there's some minor differences in the headline
Yeah,
numbers.
yeah.
Um,
Can you talk a bit more about how some of the established mixed model publishers have benefited from the collapse and the growth of the OA only publishers? What's happening there?
So yeah, this what we think is happening. It's very hard to actually connect individual papers, but this would looking at things in the round. We think really what's happened is if you think back to the first quarter of 2023, it's been well rehearsed that a number of journals were delisted from Web of Science, and that particularly affected some of the large open access only publishers that made the headlines. And what we've seen is or we think what's happened is authors have moved away, not just from the specific journals that were delisted, but maybe across more of the journals in the publishers' portfolios. And we've seen that the output from some of the very large open access only publishers has declined, going from 2022 into 2023. We think that trend is set to continue. And of course, those authors have got to go somewhere. We think what's happened to that content is a mix of cannibalization by other publishers and a leakage out of the system entirely. So we think many authors, rather than submitting to those journals in the open access only publishers, they have gone and moved instead to submit to some of the more established and mixed model publishers. So we think it is likely, if you are one of those latter publishers, you will have seen your open access output increase and your submissions to open access journals increase, but also submissions to journals with other business models. So hybrid open access, I think, has really benefited. And we've seen that grow strongly, even though output in fully open access journals has basically flattened and growth in it's collapsed. So I remember, I think Cambridge University Press put out a blog post a few months ago after our sneak peek, saying a similar thing, saying that, we found our open access has grown strongly, but Delta Think are suggesting across the whole market it's otherwise. That would make absolute sense as authors move from one group of publishers to another. And I'm calling Cambridge University Press out simply because of that blog post. Other publishers, of course, are available and have seen similar trends. So that's the cannibalization bit, authors moving from one to another. The other thing we know has happened is a great reduction in the use of special issues. And these have been the rocket fuel of growth, particularly amongst the newer, fully open access publishers. We've seen volumes of those decline markedly. Again, I think the issues around that have been well rehearsed, concerns about quality, paper mill abuse, so on and so forth, bad actors generally making life awful for everyone. And we think is a good chance that if the submissions going into those sorts of special issues is, shall I say, questionable, or their concerns around it. I don't want to cast aspersions on any publisher, but if there's a concern around that, then maybe those submissions simply wouldn't have made the cut if they would submit it to other publishers, or that the publishers who are using special issues are simply closing them down. So in that sense, there's probably a chunk of content that simply is now no longer around. Bring those two together, take the cannibalization and the sort of decline in special issues together. And I think that could explain why the market as a whole is seeing a greatly reduced growth in open access output, even while some publishers are actually benefiting from it and seeing an uptick in their submissions. So there's quite a lot of nuance and complexity once you pull apart the headlines and drill down into it. And then the point about underlying trends is we think that's set to continue. It's not as though all of a sudden after 2023 in 2024, special issues suddenly pop back up again, or authors suddenly started moving back again. So we think this could be quite a systemic change. And that the historic drivers of open access growth, which have tended to be funder policies, and then the ability of some of the newer fully open publishers to capture those and scale rapidly, those drivers seem to have changed. And now it seems to be the decisions that Clarivate's making around delisting certain journals, and that's having that's washing through to the decisions that authors are taking, combined with a change in publishing approach, perhaps, and the way that publishers are now looking to different methods to scale open access journals. So I
Yeah.
think,
And I would just
Yeah.
say on that last note, not to cut you off, Dan, but the we did see during the COVID bump, a greater increase in hybrid articles, versus articles in fully OA journals amongst the large commercial or mixed model publishers. So while of course someone could go from a fully OA publisher if they had concerns to a completely OA journal by a Springer or by an Elsevier, we're not seeing large increases in those numbers necessarily as high as we're seeing in the hybrid number of articles, that are going out for them. So it's something I think to dig into. Do the hybrid journals have a little bit more elasticity about increasing the number of articles they put out? Are they able to benefit a little bit more from economies of scale? It would seem not if it's published similar publishers, similar systems, but maybe it's something going on with the way editorial boards operate. So that would be something, that I'd be interested in looking at. And if you are a, publisher on this call and you're seeing different behavior, we again love to help you dig into that. So.
Yeah, I think it's worth underscoring the focus on research integrity in general, right?
Yeah.
Special issues and other areas where there have been concerns is limiting. And it's not the only factor, but it's definitely a factor.
And that, of course, is what's driven Clarivate's decision around certain journals, which in turn then has a knock-on effect to authors. Because I think something we know is that the journal impact factor, and it's specifically journal impact factor TM. Other metrics are available, but it's the Clarivate one that we think authors tend to use and value. And I think Emerald has done some very good research. They've done some surveys on that, which seems to form a good data point. If anybody's from Emerald's here, I hope you're going to run your survey again this year or soon, because it's really useful seeing that change over time. So I mean, absolutely, those metrics that may reflect journal quality or integrity or concerns around that process, I think absolutely are going to have quite a profound effect on the marketplace.
I'm going to jump over to the Q&A because we have a question relevant to especially our opening methodology and headlines. And that's, does the OA value include subscribe to open?
Yes, as best we can estimate it. So we survey publishers every year, and we basically ask them to fill in a simple table saying, how much stuff do you produce? How much is it worth? And can you break that down by stuff in fully open access journals, open access in hybrid, and everything else? Some publishers maybe on the boundaries may classify things slightly differently. So for example, some, if they're selling through subscription channels, think transformative agreements or subscribe to open, they may end up classing that output in the everything else bucket. So it may not appear in one of the open access buckets. So there may be a slight, if you like, fuzziness or uncertainty in the method, but we try and, as best we can, estimate that our open access numbers include subscribe to open and include the open access component of transformative agreements or mixed model deals or whatever you want to call them.
Great. And thank you for that question in the Q&A. And we've got another one, so I'll stay on this on the Q&As for a bit here. In the headlines, we mentioned that prices, assuming article processing charges, and yes, that's what we're looking at, continue to increase year over year. Do we know roughly what the annual percentage increase is for fully OA and hybrid journals?
Yes, we do, although I don't have it at the top of mind. I don't know, Heather, if, if you've got the number.
We can come back to it too if we're able
Actually,
to.
I while you were reading the question, Lori, I've gone back
You
to
looked it
look.
up?
This is actually the March 2024 news and
Excellent.
views that we do. As many of you know, we annually look at the APCs and how they're behaving both in the hybrid sense and in the gold journal context. So just some of the headlines from that compare going into 2024 for fully OA for APCs for fully OA journals, they went up about 9.5% compared to the prior year, while the hybrid prices rose by an average of 4.9, or sorry, 4.2. I'm sorry, I can't even see it today. And so the maximum APCs for fully OA journals are sitting out there at about the $8,900 point. For the hybrid journals, which we know have the very high, Cell and Nature and the like, are up to above 12,000, which is a $600 increase, from the prior year. We did see in the overall trends, there was a big increase in the 2020, 2021, when some of those high impact journals started officially offering, a hybrid option. So that, did cause a bump there. But, both types of APCs, are increasing. The hybrid ones tend to be higher to start with than the APCs for fully OA journals. But it seems that those fully OA APC prices are, increasing more quickly. And I don't know that I would say that they will catch up, because I think the hybrid ones will continue to rise as well. But, it is some behavior that we're keeping an eye on. And I would just say, kind of on that front, while I navigate back to the screen without trying to lose the webinar, that, when we talk about the discrepancy between the percentage of OA in output and the percentage of revenue that comes, from that OA content, some things that, Dan just mentioned about how publishers are allocating that. But if APCs are going up, and they're going up in, for both types of journal outputs, and we're seeing publishers get very specific, it's a rarity. There are still some publishers that have one APC across everything that they publish, but it's more common if this is a journal by journal pricing. I sometimes call it, publisher Moneyball. The nudging up at the higher end, and the sort of nudging up just below the most popular price bands, does mean that is, increasing revenue. So even though numbers might not be going up as quickly, as long as that APC costs are going up, we should, see that revenue behavior change slightly.
Yeah. So this difference in the APCs between OA only and hybrid, we have a question in the Q&A again about whether we expect that gap to close over time, or OA only, all OA, gold OA journals, APCs continue to return a lower revenue per article. I mean, it's a little bit of, what's our feel, because we don't really can't necessarily predict.
Maybe
But
Dan starts, and then I've got definite ideas too. So.
Yeah. I think slowly. So yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon that open access takes a lower share of market value than market volume. Again, your mileage may vary. Probably a couple of moving parts on that. One is, when you look at the market as a whole, there's a very, very skinny long tail of open access journals. There are many, many open access journals by number, but quite a sizable chunk of those just don't charge APCs. They might be community run journals, for example. Now we try and discount quite a chunk of those when we're trying to look at the market, because a community run journal is unlikely to exchange money for anything, subscriptions, publication fees. It's unlikely to be acquired. So we try and control that out for our sample, which we're interested in the money bit, the market side of things. But I think even then there'll be a lot of journals that are either very cheap or don't charge APCs that are fully open. So that will serve to sort of depress the amount of value that the open access share has. And the other thing is there is a pricing difference between, as Heather noted, between hybrid processing charges, which tend to be more expensive than processing charges in fully open journals. But the vast majority of open access output comes through fully open journals. So you get a lot of stuff at the lower price point, smaller amount of stuff at the higher price point. And again, I think that will tend to exaggerate the gap between open access value and value in everything else. And the trend lines for that, however, are up. So I mean, a hybrid is taking share of total open access. And as it does that at its higher price point, we'll expect it will sort of drive its revenue up. And historically, open access has been growing so quickly, it has actually, although it started from a lower base of revenue, because it's been growing so quickly, it's accounted in previous years, we think, for half the growth in the value of the total journals market. So think about how much the journals market grows overall every year. Half of that growth could be down to the growth in open access value. So in that sense, it is closing the gap. We might find, however, the gap starts to close a lot less quickly if the growth in open access has leveled off, and it's taking less share or taking share less quickly.
Yeah, and it's really dependent on the discipline and kind of what's happening. So when I do, research for publishers who are looking at their APCs to try to price them, or are thinking about adding APCs to journals that did not have them before, we always look at the numbers of journals and also the numbers of journals that are sitting at a low or no cost APC, which may be diamond or platinum journals that are going to continue to sit there, or they may be introductory offers. We try to, exclude those, when we're working with our clients. But if you are thinking of increasing or adding an APC, you do need to be mindful in the particular field of what else is happening, how many no cost, APC options, subscribe to open options are going to be available, for researchers in that space. So it's added, more complexity for publishers to take into consideration when they're making those types of decisions. But
And just for confirmation here, our survey and data, Diamond OA in terms of the output included or
It's included. So we try and estimate the whole market, including all journals of all business models, subscription only, hybrid, and fully open, aka gold. We tend to try and avoid using names that are colors, because colors are not self-explanatory. Diamond in particular can mean different things to different people. But essentially, if a publisher has an open access journal, we'll try and include it in our sample, however it's paid for. And then, of course, in the total revenues that are coming in for open access, we ask publishers to include all of those revenues in the survey. So we hope that they will allocate if you like, the sponsorship coming in for the so-called diamond journals, include that alongside the per paper publication fees that will come in from the non-diamond, however you want to call it, journals, add all those up, and that should give us a total view on the value of the market. And then I think also on diamond, that's quite an important part of it, because certainly some of the larger publishers, I think, are relying on diamond as a way of growing their open access component or niche of their output, and because they can sell publishing services to foundations or charitable institutions or funders of research, and in some ways it can be quite a if you like, a cost-effective sale. It's fewer larger numbers rather than scaling down to individual per paper pricing. So we think growth in diamond is an important revenue stream for at least some publishers.
Great. So we've talked a bit about hybrid content, and it seems that can continue to grow and take even more market share by 2027, 2028. Can we talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, just to put it in perspective, so historically, hybrid's always been the really minority sport in terms of open access. compare and contrast with, if you look at all the journals, hybrid journals are by far and away the most prevalent. There are way more hybrid journals than there are journals of any other type. I think what happened historically was around about 2014-ish, a lot of publishers implemented or rolled out or started offering a hybrid option across their, if you like, legacy or incumbent subscription journals. So we saw a really significant jump in hybrid journal numbers 10 years ago or so now. Many journals had long since offered hybrid options, and I think from the early days of open access and in the noughties and early teens, publishers would offer an open access option on a subscription journal, but usually on an as required by your funder basis. Things changed, I think, in 2014, 15, 16, when they really rolled things out. So we have lots of hybrid journals, but the uptake of the open access option within them is very, very small, being relatively small, few low single-digit percent. Lots of fully open access journals, they account for the, if you like, the vast majority of open access journals, but a small minority of all of the journals out there. But that small minority of all the journals out there covered the majority of open access content. So that's the historical trend leading into this. Over the last few years, we think hybrid open access has started to account for an increasing large share of all open access. And it was way less than 30%, I think, even a couple of years ago. And that's set to rise, I think, over the coming few years to north of 40% and maybe heading even higher. I suspect in a few years' time, given current trends, usual caveat about the future, of course, but on current trends, hybrid could maybe account for half of open access output in a few years' time, 5 years' time, 6 years' time. So that's a significant turnaround from it being the minority a few years ago. And I think there's probably a number of factors driving that. Interested in Heather, your take on why that might be.
Yeah, I think, for at the outset, I'm thinking back to like or I was around, at Springer in some of those early days when we had open options. That there was a lot of talk around what kind of an impact that would have on pricing, because if you have a certain number of articles that are open, then you don't want to be double dipping, and you're going to need to go back and look at that percentage towards your overall article output and go back. And there was a little bit of like, we don't want to maybe grow that hybrid so quickly that we're going to have to, revisit or re-justify our pricing. So it seems that now those hybrid options, not necessarily because the publishers are promoting them more, but some as a result of read and publish agreements, some as a result of, funder mandates, other types of things are driving that. And I'm not hearing the same kinds of conversations around what is going to happen to pricing or what, libraries are going to do. And that could be because there's more libraries either directly or as part of consortia, are looking to move into these larger agreements, and it's less critical to them an individual subscription price because they're looking at it in the context of a broader comprehensive payment to pay to read and publish. So
yeah, we've got a couple. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, got a quick question. The point about publishers promoting hybrid, are you picking up anything that they're beginning to do more of that in the context of transformative agreements or these read and publish and read deals, on the grounds that when you sign a deal like that, which is usually a multi-year deal, of course, your marketing in quotes doesn't stop when you sign the deal. You actually need to, through the lifetime of the deal, encourage members of the institution to use the options available. So I just wonder, I mean, to both Heather and
I
Laurie,
mean,
if you're picking up any increased marketing
I will
activity.
say yes. I could just stop right there. I think, it's when you talk about issues around academic freedom and where researchers are published, there's a hesitancy on the part of libraries to preference one publisher over another, and just because there's agreements with one publisher and not with another, I've had librarians tell me that they feel it's a little bit of a tricky area to get into. That said, when I go and look at library pages promoting transformative agreements, more and more they link to the publisher site, and the publisher site links, back to the library. So it's really a kind of a dual-sided educational and informational campaign. And I think, look, I can tell that Lori wants to weigh in on something, so I don't want to say the thing that I think you're going to say, so you say it.
So we talk to a lot of researchers, and I've been at Delta Think 11 years, and I can tell you that there are definitely trends that over that time I've seen shifts in our conversation with researchers. And Heather and I were just talking about this yesterday, that a year ago, when we talked to researchers, there was very little acknowledgement of read and publish or transformative agreements or understanding that they existed in their institution. And this is purely anecdotal. This is not a statistically relevant survey, but we are starting to hear more from researchers that they are aware that these deals are available at their institutions and taking advantage of them. So we are starting to see that marketing amp up and have an effect and have an impact on potentially have an impact on where folks are publishing.
Yeah, and someone has shot a question just to us, the speakers. Do you have any data on the change in hybrid OA publications published via APCs versus transformative agreements? Individual publishers are doing a lot of presentations on this. There were presentations recently at ALPSP, presentations at OASPA. So I think right now, individual publishers are digging into that. There's not necessarily standards around indicating journals that are included in those types of agreement, let alone articles that come, into being as part of those. So I'd be interested in, any kind of nation, standards or best practices, that are happening around that. I mean, one of the challenges around the revenue that's allocated from those agreements is that they may be capped. So there may be a certain number of articles that are coming in. They may or may not have any kind of a correlation of revenue that's changing hands, because there is a cap, or because they're kind of thrown in. Many of the agreements, for example, that are in the UK and the European context, it's a flat fee. It's not an individual letter number there. So it's going to be interesting to try to get more detail, and publishers who are digging into that, coming together and maybe doing more cross border or cross institutional analysis is definitely an area to watch.
But to clarify, because we had a couple of related questions in the Q&A as well, we're not differentiating between OA that's coming through a transformative agreement versus not in our
I think Dan's got those questions on the survey. So the degree to which we can allocate numbers, but we don't pull out and say these are part of a transformative agreement for many of the reasons that I just mentioned. So
yeah. Okay, great. All right. Looking back here now, and again, encourage folks to use the Q&A if you have any additional questions. Do we want to talk a bit about mega journals or the very large journals? And are we seeing a change there? Are we seeing any differences also across subject areas? So any nuances that we can pull out from?
So the mega journals, that was a question that Heather brought up when we were preparing for this webinar. So this is back to, if you've got some publishers whose output's collapsing or shrinking, authors are going elsewhere. What's happened to mega journals? Have they benefited if they're published by someone else? And mega journals are quite interesting. These are very large journals. And what we've seen with them over time is they tend to grow very, very quickly in the early days. They'll get an impact factor, which will boost that growth. But the arithmetic of the impact factor, and indeed any other bibliometric sort of citation density type measure, is that if you have a really fast, big journal that's growing very quickly, because the citations are taken over two prior years, if you have a huge leap in one year, it can take quite a long while for those articles to get washed through to the citation window. So what tends to happen is the impact metric will go up and then suddenly drop off as it hits a peak, as the sort of growth outstrips the ability of the citations to catch up with it. And I think we've seen this in some of the big name mega journals where they'll either grown very strongly, impact factor falls off, and then submissions decline in the wake of it, because we know that authors chase impact factors. So you tend to find output from mega journals hits a peak, falls back, and then tends to sort of wiggle around. It hits if you like, finds a level. We have noticed over in 2023 that some of the big mega journals have seen an uptick in their output. So that might therefore suggest that they have benefited from this movement of authors away from some publishers to others, and therefore they may benefit. But of course, the usual disclaimers will apply. If they start growing really quickly again, that may lead to a short-term boost in metrics, but the metrics may then fall back again, which will then have a knock-on effect and so on. So I think it's yet to see what will happen long-term with those journals. The other thing with mega journals, they were big news 5-10 years ago. There was a few of them. And then what happened, we noticed with some publishers, they'd say, well, in actual fact, rather than having one journal, one ISSN, as it were, we'll have a body of journals that between them will cover a broad spectrum and may also have these slightly different editorial criteria, moving from novel discoveries to sound science only. That was one of the other differentiators of mega journals. So in some ways, mega journals dissipated a bit as they moved from being a single journal to multiple journals across a body of content, perhaps from the same publisher. And I noticed there was a paper that came out, I think, a while ago, looking at large journals. So how do you define a mega journal? It used to be, there just used to be a list that I think an academic did. I think Stephen Penfield did a paper on it way back in the day, and he listed a number of journals. Now you might define a mega journal as publishing, let's say, more than 2,000 articles in a year, or 5,000, or, you know, pick your threshold. So even defining a mega journal now is becoming a little bit more difficult as they've started to spread out and ripple through the ecosystem.
Yeah. And we're anything to add, Heather? Or we?
No, I mean, I was thinking we need a better term, and maybe just large journals, might be it. Because I was thinking, you may have a mega journal and you don't even know it, kind of thing, because the criteria could shift. And of course, what that means moving forward, for, there was a time when we called these things container journals. Does anybody remember that? Container journals. That's just
I know one of the
term.
Subscribers to our tool, so we have an interactive tool that with this data in. Our subscribers can filter based on those kind of outliers. So look for really large journals or really small ones. They can filter for 0 APCs if you're looking at APC averages and want to include or exclude the sponsored element. So we can dice and slice the data. Of course, there's a limit to how much detail we can offer in this kind of setting. And of course, we don't want to give away our entire crown jewels. So, but we do have those breakouts, and we can also break out stuff. I think second part to your question, Laurie, was about subjects, and I'd also add to that societies. So there are different patterns across different subjects, and there are different patterns in open access uptake and growth, depending on whether you are a society-owned journal or not. And we can also break out university press-owned journals as well. So if you like, the kind of two major types of not-for-profit versus the for-profit organizations. Subjects are interesting because depending on the subject area, you will find a different level of appetite for open access. My favorite example dates from 2 or 3 years ago now, but I think it's still relevant, is that if you publish in physics, 2 or 3 years ago, I think you were looking at about 45% of your output being open access in some form, so either fully open access or hybrid. However, pull apart physics and go into high energy physics, 90% of output is open access, and most of that is in fully open gold journals. Compare that with condensed matter physics, where I think barely 15% was open access, split roughly 50-50 between gold journals, and hybrid open access. So your mileage really may vary depending on your subject area. And again, that's why behind the scenes, we do a lot of work to analyze how journals fall into different subjects. So people can then quiz the data and say, what does this mean for me, for my organization, my publisher, my specialty?
Yeah, and I think on that point, another thing that the tool does is it looks at developments over time. And so if you are finding or you're wondering if your own OA has peaked, we can drill down into those different subject areas and look at that behavior over time. And, I was looking up some stuff earlier this week, and there were a few really smaller disciplines that were flat in terms of their output growth in OA, and some that were even, declining. And in digging into, why that might be the case is, a larger project. But it's fascinating once you get to that level to look at what's happening.
And actually, we mentioned mega journals earlier. Another example of that, Heather, is I was looking at the multidisciplinary subject area. So for the big, broad brushstroke mega journals, we'll classify them as, quote, multidisciplinary. They were really growing quickly until a few years ago. And then you notice the growth just leveled off, and they were kind of flatlining, whilst other subjects were taking increasing share of open access, open access in other subjects was taking an increasing share of output. The multidisciplinary had sort of peaked and just flattened off. And again, that's probably back to that, the conversation about were mega journals dissipating across a broader spectrum of other publications. So there's all sorts of interesting trends, nuances, differences you can pull out exactly as you start to pull this apart and go into it.
I think it's interesting too, how this data, this information from the data and analytics tool and our surveying aligns with the market research that we do as well. Because when we are out there talking with researchers, we are hearing similar things. Different disciplines have a different appetite for OA, a different need for OA, a different interest in OA. And it just points to know your market, and how you really need to understand what your customer base and your market base is interested in, and where they're focused on, and doing that regularly because it changes. It's not stagnant. Along the same lines,
Laurie, sorry to cut in. Yeah, that the conversations Delta Think you'll have about what's going on out there. Qualitative feedback is the stuff they'll generate us. We then feed that back into the quant work we do for this data, particularly when we're thinking about what's going to happen next year or in the next 2 or 3 years, because you can pretty easily in Excel, you can plot some numbers on a chart, click a button in Excel, and it will draw the line of best fit. So it'll figure out the trend, and you can say to Excel, right, just project that into the future, because that's a very, very dumb calculation. It doesn't take into effect what might actually be going on in the real world. So that's something we do when we have forward-looking data in the tool, and we try and take a view, well, let's kind of bend the lines that Excel might be generating to actually reflect what reality might look like. And that's why we thought long and hard about what's open access growth is going to look like in the coming few years. It's because if you take the underlying trend, there'll be a year of slow growth, and the maths will just take you right back up to the long-term trend of high growth. That wouldn't make sense given what's actually happened in reality. So that knowing your market, getting that kind of feedback is actually very useful. So you can then take a more informed guess, I think, is probably the best way of putting it. More informed view of what the future might hold.
Yeah, agree. We have a related question in the Q&A about geography and the impact of geography on the OA picture and the trends. Do we have data on region and any changes there?
So we can split it out by location of author. That's always a bit challenging. So because that relies in turn on assumptions you make about authorship, so you can get very rapidly get into technical discussions about that. But yes, broadly, open access will depend on geography. Some of that makes intuitive sense. So for example, if you look at the UK, hardly surprisingly, in the UK, there is a much higher than average uptake of hybrid open. Why? Because that's reflecting the policies of JISC and the UK funding environment, and so on and so on. You'll get slightly different trends appearing depending on the region, largely driven by funder policies there. So I think that could be quite an interesting thing. And then again, we can pull apart individual countries, and you can see, for example, China makes headlines, of course, but we shouldn't forget the rest of Asia Pacific. And there are some quite research intensive countries, of course, out in that region. So there can be some interesting nuances when you look at individual countries. One other thing I will say about calculating this, slightly technical, but if you look at the author, so you basically you calculate the country of an article based on where the author's affiliated institution is located. That's probably the best proxy we have. And then you ask yourself, well, do you look at every author on a paper, if there's a multi-author paper, and what happens if there's all of the authors are spread across, I don't know, 5 different countries? Do you take that, every author, or do you take just the first author? Or do you take just the corresponding author? And different data has different variations on this. All of this is leading me to the headline. It basically doesn't matter. So however you count your authors, whether it's first author only or every author, you actually find very similar patterns across the data. So the predictor of the pattern tends to be the geography per se, rather than whether or not you're using a slightly different authorship model. And that's something that we seems to be coming out of the data.
Great.
There you go. More detail you could possibly need on all this stuff.
No, but good. So coming back a little bit to hybrid, and the growing in the hybrid area. But how is it reflected in the revenue, or is it not reflected really in the revenue? Can you talk a bit about what the case is and why that might be the case?
Yeah, so hybrid open access punches above its weight because the prices tend to be higher. And because hybrid is now taking an increasing share of open access output, it is taking an increasing share of open access revenue. And I think that share could comfortably double over the next few years. So it's now becoming, I think, quite a significant part of open access revenue. I think the other thing I'd say is when you compare it with fully open, it's probably set to in the next few years catch up with the fully open chunk and then maybe even overtake it. So certainly hybrid is growing strongly, albeit from a lower base. But
Yeah, I mean, but again, we do have a lot of this has been driven by agreements, and there could be a cap. It could be a flat fee. And so as we get to that scenario, as Dan describes, where maybe 50% of the content represented in a deal is going to be open access content, then perhaps 50% of that entire deal on the read side also gets allocated, in which case, we could have publishers doing it in all different ways, which would be a little bit all over the place, but it'd probably settle into some sort of a convention there. But, I many times in the past, presented this at conferences, and people have said, oh, if 20% is open and we get half, or half is open and we get 20% of the revenue, does that mean when it's all open, we'll only have 40% of the revenue? I don't think that's going to be the case. Publishers are developing new tools and services. There's other types of, revenue that can be generated. So I'm not going to say that, but it is more complexity, I think, coming into that space.
Great. All right. Any last comments from either of you? Anything you want to wrap up with that we haven't talked about?
I would just say it looks like we're reaching, a peak by some definition. That doesn't mean that what's going on is any less interesting than it was, at least, for nerds like me, when we're trying to, figure out the complexities of the marketplace. And so I'm still finding new questions, to dig into. Would love to talk to folks about, ideas that they have, and carry on the conversation in other forums.
Great.
Yeah, and I build on that. I think you're absolutely right. We've hit a peak. That's not to say we've hit the peak. So I wonder if in a few years' time we'll find that open access starts to pick up its mojo again and starts to eat or begin eating share again. And the reason that is because although the market as a whole, we've seen this reduction in open access growth, there's a lot of publishers out there that are seeing an increase in open access and are looking to it as a very key driver of their growth. And I suspect as they really dig into it, look how they can scale it and optimize it, and apply their publisher ingenuity to it, there's a good chance I think its pace will pick up. Maybe not to the spectacular levels we've seen, but it's certainly, it's not over yet. It's just a case of slowing growth for the moment. And then, let's see what happens in a few years' time.
Great, thank you. So that is a wrap for our session today. Thank you, Heather and Dan, for the great discussion, and all of you for your questions and participation today. We'll be sharing a recorded version of this session on our website in a few days, and you'll receive notification when it's available in case you want to listen again or share it with colleagues. And if anything more occurs to you, please don't hesitate to contact us. We'd love to hear from you and follow up with any questions or comments you may have. Heather and I will also be at the Charleston Conference in a couple of weeks. So if you'd like to chat in person, in real life, please contact us. We'd love to see you and say hello. And thank you again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.